Good afternoon, everyone. Our next witness is Ms. Lister, and counsel, go ahead, please.
Thank you.
She has to be sworn.
Yes. If you could be sworn, please.
Good afternoon, Ms. Tucker.
If you would repeat after me, please. I, Alicia Lister,
I, Alicia Lister,
swear by Almighty God
swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you, Mrs. Lister.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Mrs. Lister.
Good afternoon, Ms. Mulligan.
Want to start by asking you what your current employment is.
I am currently employed as a consultant to the Bermuda government as the project officer to the Commission to Inquiry and Historic Land Laws.
All right, for this commission.
Yes,
And you have been in that role assisting with the Commission of Inquiry since when?
since May of this year.
Now, fortunately for us, you also have done some research in areas that touch upon the Commission's work. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, well, let's talk about your academic history. First of all, Bermuda High School graduate.
Yes, I completed the International Baccalaureate program from the Bermuda High School in 2013.
Okay. And you went from there to university in the Netherlands, is that right?
Yes, I then attended Leiden University Honors College in The Hague, where I did my Bachelor's of Science in Global Challenges and International Development.
Okay. And how long a program was that?
That was a 2-year program, as opposed to going to the Canada, UK, where it's been 4 years. It was an accelerated honors program.
Okay. And subsequent to that, you went to Goldsmiths University of London, is that correct?
Yes, I did my master's degree there in anthropology and cultural politics.
Okay. And you did a dissertation in relation to that. So was there coursework as well?
Yes, for each of the courses that I took, namely anthropological theory, anthropology and politics, economic and political anthropology, and learning from social movements, each course required me to do coursework and extensive academic writing.
Okay. And you did a dissertation, a scholarly research and paper which you had to defend, is that right?
Yes, that's correct. My dissertation was entitled Memories Lost in the Triangle, an exploration of Bermuda's social conditioning through racial amnesia.
And when did you receive your master's degree?
I received my master's degree in December of 2018.
Okay. Now, in addition to your, well, let me stop you there and say, just for the sake of clarity, can you give us a sort of a definition of what anthropology is? What is anthropology as an area of study?
Sure, I often get asked that in the local context. But anthropology is the study of a person's culture as well as their attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors, and can also be extended to media and arts that inform the way that we conduct ourselves in daily lives.
Okay. And in addition to your studies, I see here from your curriculum vitae that you actually have been very involved with your community in Bermuda.
Yes, that's correct.
So in addition to academic studies, you've also been involved with the Future Leaders of Bermuda.
Yes, I'm the operations manager currently.
Okay. And you have been an agent with Discover Bermuda Destination Management
Yes, as a hospitality representative.
and a manager and tour guide with Hidden Gems of Bermuda.
Yes, I also owned my own tour company.
You have done prior work for the Cabinet Office.
Yes, I interned in the Sustainable Development Department one summer.
And did all of these experiences also help inform your dissertation, inform your perspective?
Yes, most definitely. Even more so when I was presented with the opportunity in 2019 to be a panelist at the University of Oxford on the Racialization and Publicness in the Africa and African Diaspora Conference, where I specifically presented on my dissertation and the racialization in post-colonial Bermuda, past and present.
With those qualifications in mind, I will ask that Ms. Lister be qualified as an expert in anthropology and cultural politics.
Council's application. I make the order that Ms. H. Alicia Lister is qualified to be an expert in anthropology.
Thank you. Now, Mrs. Lister, in relation to your evidence here, you have prepared a report, well, in relation to your dissertation, but the report is relevant to our inquiry at the Commission, Memories Lost in the Triangle, an exploration of Bermuda's social conditioning through racial amnesia.
Yes,
Is that
that's correct.
So, and you will, in due course, be providing a summary and answering questions here about your findings and conclusions.
Yes, ma'am.
So I wonder if that report then, that I've referred to, if that can be made an exhibit in these proceedings.
I believe I've marked it as AL00.
In addition, you have provided, along with your report, several exhibits, and they are marked AL01 to
AL62.
AL62, and these are your source documents, primarily the source documents that you had reference to that underlie your report and your conclusions. Is that right?
Yes, ma'am. As an anthropologist, the majority of my sources are those of other scholars.
Okay. So I wonder if those then could be marked as exhibits from AL01, is it?
Yes, AL01, and the final number is listed as AL62.
And in addition to those exhibits, you have prepared a photo collection, a slideshow of relevant photos, and that is marked as AL64.
Yes.
And if that could be made an exhibit in these proceedings as well. All right. So having taken care of those preliminary matters, I wonder if you could, I think in relation to your dissertation, if you can summarize the first several pages as they speak generally to the issues, and then go into more detail in relation to the chapters that deal specifically with Bermuda's experience.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
So to start off, my dissertation project sought to explore the ways that racial amnesia helped sustain elements of structural racism throughout Bermuda since the emancipation of slavery in 1834. The aim of this research was to begin to understand how state and self-imposed racial false consciousness has debilitated Bermuda's population socioeconomically. It's an exploration into the societal frameworks which rely on the control of public discourse and the formation of identity to sustain social cohesion.
Okay, and I'm just going to ask you to stop for a minute so I can point out to the commissioners that this, what you're reading from is at page 2 of your dissertation.
Yes,
at the
correct.
moment.
That's the beginning of the abstract.
All right. Go ahead.
Now, I want to be clear that my dissertation does not seek to be a claim on Bermuda's race relations, but rather it's a distillation and analysis of the formal and informal institutions which facilitated multi-generational miseducation and unconsciousness in support of structural racism to benefit the island's white elite. Now, Chapter 1, the introduction, deals with the dynamics of the construction of significant race throughout Bermuda's 400 history. The Chapter 2 is the methodology of my quantitative research. And Chapter 3, the literature review, defines the concepts of structural and racial amnesia. If we move on a little bit further, excuse me, I'm just flipping through here. I'd like to begin with a quote that I think is quite informing. It starts out as, "History is to the nation as memory is to the individual. An individual deprived of the memory becomes disorientated and lost, not knowing where he has been or where he is going. A nation so denied of conception of its past will be disabled in dealing with its future and present." Now, I have referred to my diagnosis of Bermuda society as racial amnesia, whereby elements of racial trauma and distress have been forgotten by the population. The peoples have been forced to forget their roots, culture, and connection to the land through suppression or replacement of memories with differential ideals which are displaced from the original context. The ramifications of the marginalized Bermuda that we've learned about from historians throughout the Commission are still being felt today due to the juxtaposing living memories of Black Bermudians and legitimized official memory of the public rhetoric. The narratives that dictate public memory are significant as memory functions as a paradigm for understanding the effects past, present on social phenomena. Now, in 2014, the Royal Gazette conducted a poll, and their findings was that racism has overtaken crime as one of the biggest issues facing Bermuda. Moving down further into the Chapter 1 of my dissertation, the phenomenon of racial amnesia is not new or solely present within Bermuda. Throughout history, there are numerous societies whose injustices have been strategically and purposely forgotten by its peoples. In 1950s, we have Canada and the taking of its Inuit peoples and the First Nation children, where they distanced them tremendously from their families and stripped them of their language and traditional skills. This is evident in Canada's will of its white elite to create future generations of non-white citizens who had forgotten and were unaware of traditions and their culture rooted in cultural distinction. Now, while less physically manipulative, we see this also in the American government as they facilitated racial amnesia through propaganda and misinformation regarding the ingenuity and the positive involvement of African Americans during World War I and its industrial era. And these racial injustices are often used to reshape the oppressed populations. It's well known that Bermudians do not enjoy equal access to wealth and resource distribution or economic prosperity, even when they possess the same non-racial qualities. Today, the impact of Bermuda's racial disparities can be seen in employment, wealth distribution, access to education, criminal justice, where Black people are marginalized and left disenfranchised. Bermuda prides itself on being a democratic country. Its population struggles with combining the ethos of racial tolerance with the pain of the stigmatizations and discriminations of the past. Now, many efforts to reconcile Bermuda's racial past with a reinvented national identity, there has also been a great emphasis on the sustainment of a collective national narrative, which has largely been imparted through mechanisms of racial amnesia. If we move down to my literature review, which happens in Chapter 3, I'm going to give a little bit of a contextual background as it relates to the anthropological theory, namely starting off with structural and institutionalized racism. Structural racism is considered normative and is sometimes legislated, but is evident in material conditions and power relations. Ms. Mulligan, if you're following me, I'm on page number 12 here.
Thank you.
Just a moment. Structural racism cannot be substantively availed through economic stimulation or elapsed time. Rather, the process, attitudes, and values and behaviors which created the disparity must first be addressed. From the inset of the racialization in Bermuda, this process of past dependency defines a society according to the confines of its race-making processes, which often remain purposely uninterrupted for generations. Inevitably, the most pervasive racial social constructs are translated into formal political, economy, and culture. A benchmark of structural racism is its ability to maintain the status quo through ensuring marginalized people have less access to the resources which would enable them to change or enhance their current realities. The consequence of supporting such systems of institutionalized racism is that it reinforces the misconceived norm of a non-white inferiority complex, whilst further legitimizing racist attitudes of the rule of law. The acceptance of structural racism, in turn, is the acceptance of societal mechanisms which are laden with prejudicial preferences and codified into policy and protocols that dictate social interactions. Speaking to racial amnesia, this study informs the inquiry of past events on current phenomena. The recognition of memories can be interpreted as a way of gaining knowledge and skills, which over time becomes an automatic and is transcribed as a social norm. Now, I, through my research, put a focus on episodic and semantic memory, which are recollections of the past which represent common knowledge rather than the individual experience. It's often argued that memory should be understood as a social object because it is located in institutions rather than individual minds, and it forms the rules, laws, standard procedures, and records, and is sometimes located collectively created monuments and markers like books, holidays, statues, and souvenirs. However, the main problem with a selective collective memory is that it can never be fully encompassing. Racial amnesia, as I mentioned before, refers to the diagnosis of a collective societal condition whereby elements of racial trauma and distress have been forgotten. This supports the hegemonic structure of whiteness and serves as a decisive mental repression, which supersedes collective memories that connect linkages of race to imperialism. The question of racial amnesia is in essence a question of false consciousness. Now, racial amnesia is manifest in two ways. We often see it in denial or disguise. These articulations of racial amnesia are transhistorical and psychological phenomena usually manifest in the process of sublimation, transference, or oppression, and is therefore constitutive itself of oppression. The most obvious way to trace historical amnesia throughout Bermuda is in the role of literature, language, and authority within racialized states, as well as elements of our society that are shaped by the ruling elites that illustrate their attitudes and behaviors that were used to control the marginalized population. Secondly, the pervasiveness and internalization of racial amnesia are best understood through the examination and construction of identities which adhere to the norms in the law. Whilst racial amnesia is sustained through institutional design, there is a cost of forgetting, as culture of misinformation is passed across generations and maintains its identity by passing on the reconstructed knowledge, values, and traditions over years, decades, and epochs. I will now begin to read further into the chapter in just a moment. As I mentioned, the role of literature, language, and authority are important in racial amnesia because the creation of these narratives, the storyteller automatically ascertains the power by creating the version of himself by setting the parameters of the other. The media also provides a platform in which the populations can negotiate identities, relationships, and values based on racial constructs. Franz Fanon in 1967 claims to explain the oppressionality of black people in that, quote, Every people in whose soul an inferiority complex has been created by the death and burial of its local originality finds itself face to face with the language of the civilizing nation, that is, with the culture of its mother country. Now, these conceptualizations of literature and language understand them to be both an expression and dispersion of knowledge, which shape individual attitudes and behaviors. Now, by eliminating the sources which challenge the values of the states, racialized oligarchies begin a process of social engineering through racial amnesia, as histories are trapped within living memory and are excluded from the public forum. For younger generations who did not experience these events, the state wishes to forget. They are raised in an era of oblivion within a state that has delegitimized their own wrongdoings through removing them from public record as if they did not exist. Now, one of the greatest challenges to whiteness is the acknowledgement of social violence enacted in the name of maintaining white superiority. And as a means of coping, governments often created cultural competency discourses to facilitate the belief in a fair and tolerant society. Understanding this, cultural competency discourse serves as a means of cultural conditioning and a post-racist political strategy which calls for the population to embrace and live within a mental habitus of pre-racial consciousness. Through the creation of post-racism narratives, white elites can successfully minimize the realities of racism. It comes to no surprise, then, that it is the racist that creates the inferior, as asserted by Franz Fanon in 1967. From that, an institutional shift would create new opportunities for self-empowerment and positive and more accurate identity constructions. The long-lasting impacts of historical and racial amnesia is that the creation of new generations which struggle with an identity that is constantly under construction and constantly at odds with itself. W.E.B. Du Bois in 1905 recognized this as a double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on amused in contempt and pity. However, this lifelong self-reflective image fuels the plight of black self-actualization and in turn stimulates a will to attain true self-consciousness whilst merging his double self into a truer and better self. Ms. Mulligan, if you're following me now, I'm now on to page 18, Chapter 4, Missing in Memory.
Thank you.
The first slaves were introduced into Bermuda during the 1620s, shortly after the island was colonized by the British in 1612. The process of slave ownership was made widely accessible to the whites, and although slave prices were based on demand, a slave could be ascertained through sale, auction, legal seizure, or gift. During the 17th century, due to the abundance, ease of access, and low valuation of black people, black slaves on the island and black children could be purchased for £8, black women between £10 and £20, and black men at £26. Despite the acceptance of slavery amongst most of the white oligarchy, blacks remained a manifest resistance against the systematic oppression. Although confined to an island of only 22 square miles, many slaves rebelled and attempted to escape their masters and found refuge in Bermuda's coastal caves. Over time, black slaves collectively masterminded rebellion and escape tactics, which evolved into conspiracies to murder their masters. Slavery and indentured labor continued on the island up until 1834, when the emancipation of slavery took effect under the British Empire. Despite the influx of African, Native American, Irish, Scottish, and Latin American peoples, Bermuda's demographic remained predominantly white up until the 18th century. With the inset of the emancipation of slavery sweeping across the West Indian nations, many freed slaves migrated to Bermuda. However, once reaching the island, the formerly freed slaves were forced into indentured labor for 7 years as a means of repayment for the administration and transportation from the Spanish territories. This influx of many black immigrants to Bermuda caused upset and fear amongst the white population. Hence, they severely increased the 7-year term of indentured labor to 99 years in hope of discouraging larger numbers of black migrants, as this would essentially revert them to slaves for life. Despite the emancipation of slavery, the white oligarchy was keen on maintaining power over the black population through structural racism that would inhibit them economically and politically. Post-emancipation, white slaveholders were offered compensation for their lost income for returning the slaves to freedom, whilst the black slaves were not compensated for the years they had been economically raped. Another example of this institutionalized racism is that pre-1834, the only qualification to vote was to own property valued at 40 pounds or more. Following the Emancipation Act, this amount was raised to 100 pounds to deter the blacks with low financial standing. This property voting system allowed white property owners to vote in every parish that they owned property, whereby giving them voters' advantage over the disparate black counterparts. The 1834 Voting Act has been regarded as one of the most crippling methods employed by whites to maintain political control over the island well into the 20th century. 130 years following the emancipation from slavery, the property-based voting system was dissolved and reformed into the Parliamentary Election Act of 1963. However, this new legislation further glorified the white wealth and enhanced the white political power as the voting age was changed from 21 to 25, allowed property owners an extra vote, and permitted Commonwealth citizens a vote after 3-year residency. By the late 1919, black Bermudians had maneuvered their way through the disadvantaged economic conditions and began creating their own sources of revenue through agriculture, shipbuilding, and privateering. In the early 1920s, tourism superseded all the sectors and became the main contributor to the local economy. At this point, the interests of the American tourists and the United States government were valued much higher than that of black Bermudians. During this time, the island was segregated. Blacks could not rent or own property in white-designated areas. They were excluded from movie theaters, golf courses, clubs, or functions which whites patronized. Blacks were also limited from service jobs to limit the interracial interaction. For example, black people were prohibited from working in the post office, as whites would be offended at the sight of blacks licking their postage stamps. With the influx of the white American tourists, blacks were also not allowed to work in the main street, known as Front Street, as the tourism industry was developed on the predicate that wealthy white North Americans would not come to Bermuda if Bermuda was not segregated. During this era, the Bermuda government undertook a regentrification process of the Tucker's Town area, in which they forcibly removed approximately 400 black Bermudians out of their community in order to develop an inclusive, wealthy enclave for white tourists to enjoy. With the displacement and relocation of black Bermudians, the white oligarchy systematically created geographies of poverty. The 1919 Registrar General report stated that the infantile death rate of children under 12 months old was at 20.5% for blacks and 6.1% for whites. This statistic was interpreted by a foreign consultant as a result of unhygienic surroundings. Bermuda was systematically putting its future labor force underground. In the report by the Medical Sanity Matters Bermuda. During the 1920s, several young blacks had to live among the packing crates along the docks on Front Street. They survived off the scraps that they could beg for people coming off ships that entertained arriving and departing visitors by diving into the water to recover the coins that were thrown at them. The relocation of blacks into the parish of Pembroke made it the most densely populated area, with 39% of the demographic, equaling 4,833 people, inhabiting the 6 square kilometer space. The obvious issues surrounding high population density were further exacerbated by the surrounding Pembroke Marsh, which expanded 94 acres and hosted swarms of mosquitoes, which spread throughout the infectious wells that received tainted water from the dumping of the city's sewage waste system. Understandably, these poor living conditions birthed many illnesses and disease, but even the black community-based health facilities were infested with roaches and rats. Through the fear of black spread illness, the government created the 1920 Public Act, which decreed that, quote, infected people could not enter any public place, which further restricted the movements of blacks into the main city and the tourist hub. Additionally, it was mandated that those that were sick should report to the local newspapers, the Royal Gazette and the Daily Colonist. The government's legitimization of the displacement of black Bermudians paved the way for the success of the white tourist market of the 20th century, and also gave justification for the 1930 Hotel Keepers Protection Act, which gave establishments the right to refuse any black or Jewish guest. segregation remained a key element in Bermuda's social structure. In 1953, the Select Committee on Race Relations declared it as an economic and social necessity. Since its inception as a British colony, arguably up until 1964, Bermuda was controlled by the white elite oligarchy known as the 40 Thieves. Those members were mainly merchants who controlled Bermuda's central business district, the Front Street. However, they also had political power and maintained a system of social and economic control and segregation in schools, churches, and businesses. Blacks who dared to push for change risked losing their jobs or having their mortgages called in. The fruition of the black social movement began in Bermuda in 1959 during the theater boycott, which occurred during a major dock workers' strike and resulted in the desegregation of Bermuda's hotels and restaurants. The theater boycott was a notable point of social change in Bermuda's theater, as it was a microcosm for Bermuda society. Where seat assignment was according to race. Civil unrest and political reform came to head in Bermuda throughout the 1960s, which was marked by the creation of the two-party political system upon the inception of the black-backed race, the PLP, the Progressive Labour Party, in 1963. The opposition, the UBP, the United Bermuda Party, by origin, became the nature and political organ of the 40 Thieves. In 1964, the United Bermuda Party was founded and proceeded to win every election for the next 34 years. During the early works of the UBP, their policies focused on the desegregation of the school system and increasing educational prospects. However, this did not remedy the race-based social turmoil. During 1965 and 1968, there were numerous riots, and between the span of 10 months in 1972, the police commissioner, the governor, his aide-de-camp, the supermarket owner, and his bookkeeper were shot dead. And in 1977, there were riots in response to the execution of the martyred murderers, all as acts of revolt against our racist colonial system. As an attempt to further dispel the social upset, the government invited a foreign commission to investigate the root cause of the island's surmounting issues, which was inevitably determined to be racial inequality. In Bermuda, there seems to be a natural affinity between race dynamics and the voting system, as the PLP is mainly supported by black Bermudians, whilst the UBP had a white majority makeup. In 2009, the Bermuda Democratic Alliance was formed as a breakaway party from the UBP, which could leverage more voters from the opposition party. However, it was soon realized that the separation of the party provided an opposition with a better chance at winning an election due to the vote splitting. Hence, the UBP and BDA entered into a merger agreement 2 years later, forming the new One Bermuda Alliance. Under the newly named institution, the party's slogan was "Putting Bermuda First," and its policies focused on balancing and minimizing the fiscal budget, strengthening security forces, stimulating small businesses, improving education, and enhancing immigration policies. Following the social unrest of the 1960s and 70s, Bermuda's government was keen to reestablish a state of non-direct violence and a calm public rhetoric, by which they implemented an intense program of social engineering between the 1970s and 80s. The scope of counterintelligence employed by the Bermudian and British American governments created a vacuum in historical consciousness, as called by Dr. Keto Swan. In regards to the mistreatment of blacks and the social uprisings in the 1970s, so much so that many of younger generations today are unaware of the fact that Bermuda even had its own social unrest and black power movement. Chapter 5, the conceptualization of Bermuda memory. In order to grasp a clear underpinning and understanding of Bermuda's contemporary racial frameworks, the country's unique institutional and cultural substantives must first be explored to highlight which social, political, and economic unequivocal elements are formulated and exacerbated due to the racial undertones. Now, the study of Bermuda's contemporary social-economic race-based issues and the extent of which racial amnesia is further complicated by its distinctive composition as the oldest British colony, an international business hub, a world-class tourist destination, and a multicultural society which combines American, Caribbean, and Eastern European influences. Whilst Bermuda has seemingly evolved from the blatant racist acts of the 17th century, it is important to acknowledge the writings of Stuart Hall, who proposed that racism is not always overtly observable, but is often inferential. In 2013, the Media Council of Bermuda stated that The extent of knowledge of Bermuda's racial history varies tremendously amongst members of the media. It is difficult even for experienced Bermudian journalists to have anything approaching a complete knowledge of factual history. Even the best educated, experienced, and most understanding journalist will be challenged by the long legacy of historical events, which include modern social and political problems and widespread fears and suspicions, myths and conceptions. Although much racial discourse in Bermuda is not present in formal transcription, it is prevalent amongst the living memory of the older generations, and is a successful means of replacing the dominant narrative that failed to describe the experience of those that it disempowers. The reshaping of racial narratives was a strong aim of the PLP government during their inaugural running in 1963. Excuse me, I've just lost my page. There we go. In 1963. However, this aim was greatly undermined by past efforts of knowledge and narrative manipulation. Since the early 1900s, the island's white elite saw the importance of controlling the public knowledge and discourse through literature and media and began to legalize the prohibition of particular race-based texts. The British government began by banning A Negro World, an African-American newspaper in the 1920s, a publication of the Universal Negro Improvement Association and the African Communities League. 40 years later, in 1960, Muhammad Speaks, a newspaper speaking from the Nation of Islam, was banned. In addition, Frantz Fanon's 1961, A Wretched Earth, which spoke about the dehumanizing effects of colonization. By prohibiting literature and certain discourses throughout the island, the white oligarchy and Bermuda government were able to systematically control the education of blacks and inhibit them from consuming information that challenged the colonialist goals. By monitoring public knowledge, the elitist rule was able to ensure that intellectual resistance could be limited and the cross-generational spread of conflictual narratives controlled. Bermuda's daily newspaper, the Royal Gazette, has historically been used as a political weapon against black Bermudians, as articles often include tirades bordering fanatical paranoia, displaying the white population grossly ignorant of black people, Bermuda and Africans' history, yet profoundly arrogant enough to believe that they actually knew what was best from the island. That was also quoted from Dr. Swan. The oppressive rhetoric and exclusion of positive black journalism from the mainstream media allowed the success of black Bermudians to go unnoticed, injustice of whites to be ignored, and further supported the race-based class structure through its diminutive language. However, in the wake of political unrest, the media and government changed tactics of mental oppression and sought to diffuse racial tension by downplaying the racial elements. The recreation of an integrationist narrative of black progress intended to convey the notion that history of the blacks in Bermuda had been relatively devoid of political struggle because race relations on the island had always been good. This method of racial amnesia promoted, as quoted from Dr. Swan, the idea that slavery in Bermuda was benign and that blacks were treated relatively well by whites as opposed to blacks in the wider African diaspora. Likewise, the colonialism and paternalism were responsible for the relative material affluence of black Bermuda as opposed to the black struggle against oppression. Furthermore, after desegregation in the 1960s, blacks no longer had to struggle, as an integration had brought blacks into the promised land of social equality of the whites. The races continued to work together to craft Bermuda into a tranquil paradise acceptable for tourism and international industries. Post-emancipation language and narratives were tactfully manipulated in order to control the dissemination of post-colonialist knowledge and emotion, convince the blacks of the population of their own inferiority, and minimize the acknowledgement and accountability of white attitudes and behaviors. The Racial Amnesia Project sought to socially engineer a middle-class black population which would serve as a grassroots link for the white elites' identity. It was clear through the formal institutions implemented by the Bermuda government during the 1960s and 70s that it was understood that the official dissolution of the formally imposed segregation had deep implications for the maintenance of social identity and the creation of a new sense of community. However, the government's attempts to maintain social cohesion during this period were heavily challenged by the Black Power movement. It should be noted that the key aim of the Black Power movement was to achieve political independence from the United Kingdom in order to reconstruct the class-based socioeconomic and political structures. Although Black Power is often interpreted simply to be anti-white, it encompasses ethos of Black self-determination. In response to this movement, the white oligarchy sought to employ racial amnesia through successful dislocating the Bermudian population from other Pan-African movements to dilute the angst against the colonial structure. Although Black protest in Bermuda can now be traced back to the Arab enslavement as an initial revolt against the colonial institution, unlike their Pan-African brothers and sisters, Bermuda had accepted colonialism as a necessity, whilst its notable comrades in England's Black Power Party had proclaimed the Black Power movement to be anti-exploitation, anti-capitalist, and anti-imperialist. During this time, the government sought to shape a collective Black identity which valued the notion that foreign Blacks would stir up trouble amongst the good and mild-tempered Negroes of Bermuda, which dubiously suggested that Blacks in Bermuda had either no reason to resist the white hegemony or were not aware of their oppression. However, within a decade, the Bermudian troops have been deployed to the island 5 times, in 1986, 1969, and twice in 1970 and 1977, in response to social movements, as Bermuda's Black Power movement was perceived as a collective and direct challenge to colonialism, which was an unnatural anarchism in any country, much less a wealthy island such as Bermuda. As argued by Foucault in 1979, white governmentality relies on technologies of the body, which aim to control and discipline conduct through populist racist ascriptions and moral panics, which inform the limitations placed on racial others' spiritual mobility, economic status, political participation, and social visibility. Despite the government's aim to limit the mobility of Black Power movement through military force, they had failed to degenerate its ability to empower and educate the Black community, henceforth creating a population who are constantly aware of the force and excessive surveillance used to control them and are unfaithful to the justice system to protect them. It has become evident that Black Bermudians are without any illusion of return to the past and are a product of their new situation as much as any original location. There is often much contention in dialogue in what constitutes a true Bermudian. Although the island was found uninhabited and ancestral roots have many linkages to parts of the globe, it became more fashionable to pretend to an indigenous identity than a settler slave status, pushing the identity of a colonial slave to the margins of allowable acceptance. In this way, the Black Bermudian population also created their own imposed catalyst for racial amnesia as a coping mechanism for the displacement and dispowerment forced onto them by the colonialist elite. Although this means of self-segregation and alienation from the past was an attempt to protect the Black Bermudian community from its new oppressive narratives, it further reinforced and legitimized the sense of otherness originally created by the white man. Frank Manning in 1981 argues that Black Bermudians adopt a perversion of cultural events that emphasize their economic standing, which reflects their rejection of a stance of social inferiority in favor of a positive and assertive sense of self-awareness. This rejection of forced identity works to forget racial disparities and also allows for the disadvantaged to live in a euphoric state in which their racial realm and criteria for social status is self-constructed and a conflated means of self-preservation. In this sense, Black Bermudians not only face challenges of adhering to the social norms of the white man, but must now also work to meet the status quo of his own race. The mechanisms of structural racism on a societal level and racial amnesia on an individual level are at work simultaneously to shape the Black Bermudian identity, which remains flexible within varying racial contexts. The dichotomy between the appreciation of Black excellence and white appropriate behavior often plays on the integral struggle in which it was quoted in Frank Manning's 1981 text from a Bermudian, saying, "We Black Bermudians," an old man cautioned, "can easily fool you. We're laughing on the outside, but crying on the inside." Proving true to Fannin's 1967 claim that after having been enslaved to the white man, he enslaves himself. Today, however, There is a strong push with the younger generation of Black Bermudians to redefine their social narrative and reclaim a higher place within society, as they refuse to be fixed or defined by an official version of identity, and deeply accept an idea that self-narration achieves self-empowerment. Unintentionally, the efforts asserted by the white oligarchy created future generations constructed through the resultant hybrid nature of the identities and consciousness of the diaspora. Now, despite being contained to a small landmass of 21 square miles, the British oligarchy successfully employed geographies of inclusion as a means of impression at an early phase of racial amnesia, speaking specifically to the families displaced from Tuckerstown and the St. David's Island. This policy that supported the dislocation of these families supports the theory of imaginaries linking the social and the psychic, placing race at the center of the cityscape, and reproducing the centrality of the couplet of race and the nation, which allows racism to operate as a disciplinary mode in which the fact of being seen provides the optimum conditions for surveillance identification as an alien and threatening presence. The displacement and relocation of Black Bermudians to areas known as Devil's Hole and back of town not only create a site of manifestation for poverty and crime, but also created the notion that Black Bermudians were naturally devoid of high-value property ownership. As recognized in Gooden in 2014, racial disparities are not randomly assigned but are embedded within and across societal structures. As quoted and mentioned by Ms. Mulligan earlier, I said that housing, its location, and quality have a significant impact on a person's life trajectory. Therefore, to be confined to an impoverished, racially segregated neighborhood is likely to increase a person's chance to have adverse interactions with the criminal justice system based on diminished educational opportunities and limited employment prospects. As noted by W. Du Bois in 1905, to be a poor man is hard, but to be a poor race in a land of dollars is the bottom of hardships. The control of the Black Bermudian population through displacement, relocation, and monitored movements allowed the white oligarchy to successfully build the foundation for cumulative disadvantage of disparity, leaving the Black Bermudians disenfranchised and systematically polarized within a society that deemed them to be less than significant. Cultural competency. It can be argued that the aims of the UBP during their 34-year tenure were attempts to remedy racial tensions throughout the islands through a means of imaginative construction of histories and memories that may not be strictly truthful, but will forge a reality that is bearable to all the members of the divergent community. Now, according to Frank Manning in 1981, quote, "The UBP's trump card was the promise of a thoroughgoing partnership, the term used in campaign slogans between blacks and whites of the running of Bermuda," end quote. Similar to the converging influences of Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, it is argued that it took the threat of the political violence to force the UBP to make even the most basic changes to its socioeconomic policies against the blacks. Much of their acceptance of the UBP amongst Bermuda's black population was due to their political strategy, which involved recruiting black candidates and putting Black Bermudians in highly visible positions throughout the party. The UBP employed many tactics throughout the 1960s and 70s to prove that their level of cultural competency, including the introduction of a black party and Senate members, the naming of a black premier, Sir Edward Richards, who was tenured from 1971 to 1975, the appeasement of the majority of the black parliamentary reformist group, and the gradual acceptance of the demands made by the internal Black Caucus. As a means of social control, the UBP presented the partnership between white and black Bermudians as a partnership which served as a guarantee of social security as well as an opportunity for gain. Only through the visible demonstration of racial integration, it was claimed, can Bermuda continue to attract tourists and international companies through the sources of prosperity. The only issue with the implementation of this fallacy was that it greatly ignored the present and future agency of Bermuda's black population. Additionally, it can be argued that this type of social engineering can be interpreted as a new form of racism disguised as cultural competency whilst exacerbating the racial amnesia. Whilst the OBA have presented platforms which have said to be acknowledge and alleviate the plights of the black Bermudian community, their methods resemble new racism by otherizing non-whites and by deploying modernist and absolutist views of culture whilst using non-racist language. Though creating such platforms emphasize a superficial unity of the governments, it created an ontology of forgetting our racial histories, which perpetuates the view of Bermuda as a fair and tolerant society, despite the reality of pervasive racism. Although many feel comfortable with the notion that Bermuda is in a post-racist state, this fallacy disavows history, overlaying it with an upbeat discourse about how things are never really that bad, are not so bad now, and are only getting better. Whilst efforts to stimulate racial amnesia are not overt in modern times, it is argued that the concept has been sustained by flying under the flag of colorblindness, multiculturalism, or racial tolerance, contemporary rhetoric, whether international or otherwise, to mask or cloak the reality of racism today, diminishing or downplaying its significance, even as quotidian instances of racism. To conclude, and quoting Du Bois once again, the notion has not yet found peace from its sins. The freed man has not yet found freedom in his promised land. Painfully, this quote holds true to the current racist noose that constrains Bermuda. But it begs the question of whether or not peace and freedom must be achieved simultaneously. If not, which concept has been deemed sanctimonious enough to come first? Why then has Bermuda forgotten? Significantly, the majority of the cases have little to do with the education system, but rather the nature of Bermudian culture and the kind of civilization that Bermuda has evolved to today. Wide level of societal acceptance of disparity and deviating realisms of Black Bermudians are heavily linked to organizational practices, institutional framework, and public sentiment. As Schneider and Ingham in 1993 noted, the relationship between social construction, positive or negative, and power, high or low, is related to whether groups either benefit or are burdened by policy decisions. Acknowledging that structural racism is practically impossible to dissolve, its outcomes in health, education, employment, environmental risk, occupational status, and crime are not randomly assigned. They are embedded in a historical structure where racial minorities are chronologically experienced pervasive negative differences. These differences compound exponentially to generate a cycle of racial saturation that continues generation after generation. Whilst the true reflection of Black Bermudian memory is hard to ascertain, as it has been actively suppressed and whitewashed by historical accounts of the colonial powers. As the oldest British overseas territory, it is no surprise that historically there has been a persistent hegemonic preoccupation with the governing and racialized other. The nationalist imaginary increasingly evokes the regulatory structure of whiteness in appropriating the political and cultural experiences. Acknowledging the efforts by both governmental and non-governmental entities to reimagine social narratives and to create a new identity, many have recognized that these efforts cannot pretend to solve existent political oppression, although it does set up a viable alternate to one-sided nature of officially endorsed accounts of history. These organizations have both emphasized their appreciation for the realization that discrimination deprives both the perpetrator and the victim of their humanity. However, it calls into question at what point, if at any, does the value for humanity supersede the value for political economic power. Additionally, it attempts to contrive a new national identity that can be interpreted as a new neocolonial substitution for one oppressive ideology than the other. Ignoring past atrocities and creating a new Black Bermuda ignorant of past communal sufferings. Arguments supporting past governmental efforts of cultural competency can be analyzed as a refi of race through modernist and colonialist lenses as an ontology for forgetting Bermuda's history of white supremacy that thrived on imperial projects that proved central to the state's formation and ascendancy. Although Bermuda still remains as the oldest colony, the Black Bermudan population is still a fugitive of colonial oppression, as its members of society are still bound by the racist and colonial institutions that entrapped their slave ancestors over 400 years ago. Despite the success of the racial and historical amnesia as a means of sustaining social cohesion, its implementation greatly ignored the consequences of the multifaceted genealogy of the country's current population. It is clear from the British and Bermuda government's repertoire that there was a blatant understanding of the importance in sustaining a shared national narrative. However, it is important that all members of Bermudian society are privy to the notion that pure social cohesion can only be achieved through creating social orders that are aimed towards remembering, acknowledging, and transforming its racial memory rather than denying and forgetting. The island's race politics do not pre-exist its rhetorical performance and do not hold a sacrosanct value. Rather, it should be understood that they are made to be pervasive and have been neutralized or caused socioeconomic environments, making them amenable to change, critique, and re-articulation. It's argued by Faye Velasquez in 2006 that amnesia can be transcended by digging into the past and unfreezing the sedimentary strata of the pain and mutism. It is a question of traversing the discontinuities and ruptures of memory and understanding their meaning. The work of an amnesia helps to rebuild a unified identity. One must face written histories that erase and deny and reinvent the past to make the present vision of racial harmony and pluralism more plausible. To bear the burden of memory, one must willingly journey to places long uninhabited, searching the debris of history for traces of the unforgettable, and knowledge of all that have been repressed. Today, there seems to be great resistance to Bermuda's racial amnesia and a thirst for self-empowerment through self-narration. Black Bermudians of younger generations refuse to be fixed or defined by official versions of their identity. Unlike their ancestors, they have rejected the acquiesce of forgetting and have rather embraced a duty to remember. Whilst acknowledging and correcting racial amnesia attempts to understand and alleviate social conditions, it once again traps the black body within the pain of its ancestors. And as Franz Fanon said in 1967, the Negro, however sincere, is always a slave of his past. Thank you.
You've given us a lot of information, and I'd like to try to bring that information more closely into focus of the Commission's work,
Yes,
of the
ma'am.
inquiry. And one of the things that you've talked about is the concept or the notion of racial amnesia in Bermuda. In relation to Tuckerstown and in relation to St. David, we have at least heard from Dr. Swan, Dr. Francis, about the lack of any official record
Yes.
that seemed to reflect what was happening at the time, as far as from the perspective of the St. David's Islanders and the people who lived in Tuckerstown.
Yes.
Were you, in your anthropological review, were you able to find anything more than they were able to find about the actual voices of the people who were experiencing these dispossession of their lands?
Actually, I would say that I found less than the historians, that being Dr. Francis and Dr. Swan, because much to their advantage, they had access to the U.S. and British archives. Much of my research was based on scholarly articles that would be available online, as I conducted it while I was in the UK. But you often hear throughout the Bermudian community that these archives are missing, or there was a fire, or they've been displaced, or they're underneath someone's bed. So this is well known amongst the Bermudian community. But I think it often is apparent through normal dialect and colloquialisms. For example, you often hear people say, "Oh, well, who's your mom?" or "What part of the island you're from?" But the average person wouldn't link that back to the expropriations and families being split up around the island. So you have the generational gap where you don't know if, for example, the Smith family was in St. David's or Somerset, and now you're trying to put your family back together. So you see the gaps in information being passed down through generations in different ways.
Okay. You talk also at length about, I think you call it structural racism, but would that be the same as what we've heard the term institutionalized racism,
Yes.
systemic racism.
Yes.
All right. So, understanding that term as you do, and having explained to us the role it's played in Bermuda, I want to take it back to the laws that were passed in Bermuda that allowed for these lands to be expropriated.
Yes.
The laws were passed, we've been told, by members of Parliament, but they were also members of the white oligarchy, the white merchants, the bankers
Correct.
that controlled much of the island's economic life.
Yes, they're well known throughout the Bermuda community as the 40 Thieves.
Okay. So when you talk about structural institutionalized racism, the fact that it was impossible at that time for any black Bermudian to be a member of Parliament,
Yes.
would that be an example of the institutionalized or structural racism that you're talking about?
Most definitely, especially being that the people that are in Parliament are seen to be representatives of their constituencies. So if there's no representation of the House of Black people, then their voices could not have been heard during that time.
And where our institutions, such as government institutions, Parliament, are set up structurally to perpetuate racism, such as in the case where only the white elite have entry into Parliament, right?
Yes.
Where they're set up to perpetuate racism, do we see things like the laws appropriating lands being passed without consultation with the black community?
You often do see that. The laws, I'm sure, were first created as a function of the state, but they were then manipulated for the white oligarchy benefit.
You talk about, I like to use the term rewriting history. You talk about this amnesia, racial amnesia. Is it that, I don't want to use the word benign, but is it just forgotten, or was there in your anthropological review any evidence that in fact the white power structure had tried to erase the history?
Yes, I would say that there were intentional acts. As I mentioned, the banning of literature and books, that firstly limits the education that you have on topics that would have related to black empowerment, as well as the laws that would have limited black movement and other economic involvement at that time.
Okay. We heard from Dr. Swan about newspaper articles that locally said, well, you know, the people of St. David's were quite generous and happy to support the empire.
Yes.
But internationally, the same meetings were described as being people jumping to their feet and being quite upset.
Exactly.
So when our future generations look back at what is available locally as far as newspaper reports and accounts of these events, does that exacerbate the racial amnesia?
Most definitely. If you are given the perspective that everything was benign, fine, and happy, then you have no interest of self-reflection to deter that narrative. I myself, as we went through earlier, attended the Bermuda High School, and when I asked where our Black Bermuda history was, I was told it's irrelevant.
When you talk about in your dissertation, I'm going to take you to page 19 of your dissertation. And I want to talk about, just build up the context to 1920s, and 1940s, when these incidents that we're looking at occurred. Yeah, page 19, you talk about the first, and I'm going to talk just post-emancipation, not before that, but post-emancipation, when black slaves were freed, they weren't compensated.
Correct.
Slaveholders were compensated for
Yes,
their
that's
loss.
correct.
Further, in addition to being economically disadvantaged by being by being freed, for want of a better term, the voting property that your person had to own to vote was raised. Is that right?
Yes, it was.
Okay. And in this case, a male had to own to vote, I should say. It wasn't females at all by this time. It was just males.
Yes, and they increased the voting age. Is that what you're referring to on page 19?
Increased from 40 pounds to 100 pounds initially, right?
Yes, ma'am.
So now we have a population that was economically disadvantaged and unable to vote for the most part at that time. Is that correct?
Yes, and those that would have been displaced if they were losing the agricultural lands, they also lost their livelihoods.
Okay. So we're coming up now to the 1920s where you say in your dissertation that by the late 19th century, black Bermudians had maneuvered their way through the disadvantaged economic conditions and began creating their own sources of revenue through agriculture, shipbuilding, and privateering. And I might also add, from what we've heard, certainly fishing.
Yes, and I believe going off the back of Dr. Swan's research that he presented, in the early 19th century, there were laws that were introduced that were more restrictive on the black economic movement.
Yes. But by the time we get to the 1920s to the 1940s, we've heard, certainly in the case just recently of St. David's, that these ways of life, agricultural, fishing, shipbuilding, whaling, all of those economic sustainability, the economic sustainability of St. David's, for instance, was based on those activities.
That's correct, yes.
Okay. So when you say they maneuvered their way through disadvantaged economic conditions, based on your review, were there limited other opportunities to engage in business, merchandising, that sort of thing in the 1920s to 40s in Bermuda for black Bermudians?
I don't believe so. As I mentioned, their involvement was also limited in the civil service, and it was promoted that segregation of blacks throughout Bermuda was the only way to ensure the tourism product going forward. And at that time, being as that was the main economic thrust on the island, we would have been further disenfranchised to keep that motive moving forward.
Okay. So when the lands were taken in Tuckerstown and in St. David's, and we saw from the records
Yes.
that residents were saying, I've lost, I can't fish, I can't, my crops, it took me 12 years to do this. When the residents were saying that, this long history of building up a sustainable economic community
Yes.
seems to have been shattered. Is that-
Absolutely. They would have went back to absolutely nothing, where you had those that were slave owners before being compensated at the same time.
Okay.
So just adding on to that point, as we have seen through the evidence of Dr. Francis and Dr. Swan, those that were displaced, some of them received compensation, which was much lower than what they had appraised the land at. You had the British Empire at that time still paying slave owners.
And we also heard that many of them said, many of the residents said they could not be compensated. They didn't want to sell their homes. They could not be compensated. And indeed, the records seem to suggest that they, for large part, weren't.
Yes.
Okay. So if we go on to the next portion of your dissertation, just to clear up a few points, you say during this time, and now we're talking about the 1920s, where you've indicated tourism superseded all other sectors, became the main contributors to the local economy. At this point, the interest of American tourists and United States government were valued much higher than that of a black Bermudian. During this time, the island was segregated. Blacks could not rent or own property in white-designated areas, were excluded from movie theaters, golf courses, clubs, or functions in which whites patronized. Correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Given that, from a political culture perspective, when we heard in the evidence and the documents, for instance, in St. David's, that theaters, black clubs, black institutions at St. David's were abandoned, well, were seized,
Yes.
expropriated, what effects would that have, in your opinion, on those individuals, on that community?
It would have had a great effect. As I mentioned before, these sites would have been places of identity formation, where you would go in and discuss your day or social norms. So without having some place to go in, as I think Dr. Swan referenced yesterday was the barbershop. You remove the barbershop, the grocery store, the church. These are elements that we see in our society today as key points that I'm sure all of us look forward to sharing with our community. So if you remove those, you lose much of the community sense.
Okay. So that's the cultural and economic impact. You also go on to discuss the impact of dislocation and relocation of black Bermudians in 1920 from the Tuckerstown area. You talk about the health impact,
Yeah.
the life impact
Yes.
on people. And you've indicated that your research suggests that what was created were geographies of poverty, pockets of poverty where really almost exclusively black Bermudians were made to live,
Correct.
unable to participate in the white economy
Yes.
and having lost their own.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And what you've shown us is that evidence from the archives that in fact the black population, the death rate of children was much higher, illness rates, infections were much higher, and diseases in these areas.
Yes, as we've learned in this COVID period, a high density causes things to spread faster, and that would have most definitely been the case back then.
And even the black community-based health facilities that were made available were not hygienic.
That's
Is that
correct. Allegedly, there were mosquitoes and rats rampant.
And you said, having isolated black Bermudians in these conditions that were removed from Tuckerstown, the government then became afraid of the spread of illness.
Yes, and they used the introduction of the 1920 Public Act, in whereby they further marginalized and stigmatized the black community, because if you were found to be sick, you had to tell the newspaper, which means the whole island knew that you were sick, and you were also contained within an area.
Now, you're younger than most of us. And you will have a better memory. Was any of that taught to you in high school?
No, and I couldn't tell you one children's book I read it in, or any Bermuda movies that it circulated in the wide public discourse either.
And you, appears to me from your CV, you were an active young person in your community and involved in community events and charities.
Yes, ma'am. It seems to be a great silence in the younger generations that are not aware of recent historic events so far as the 80s and 70s. They don't know that we had boycotts. They don't even know that we had slavery. And it's quite upsetting.
When did you, or how did you, first sort of raise your own social consciousness in relation to these issues?
They say that an anthropologist, all his work is autobiographical by nature. So as I undertook my master's thesis, they challenged us to have an introspection look at ourselves and choose a topic that we could relate to. And during that time, it was just following the 2017 election. So I was very curious in the different sentiments and couldn't understand why the PLP and Black Bermudians were so upset and what was going on. So I decided at that point I was writing my dissertation on the political history specifically. But then once I read the literature, I noticed that there was a gap. And the gap spoke more of what I could not find than what was present.
So one of the recommendations that have been made by other experts to the commission is that this whole gap in education, particularly Black Bermudian history,
Yes.
and the history of incidents such as Tuckertown, or incidents, I shouldn't call them that, but the history of the land being taken at Tuckertown and at St. David's, for instance. The history of oppression and Black Bermudians being all moved to Pembroke and suffering
Yes.
this existence. The recommendation is that collective amnesia, that the memory be revived.
Yes, I would like to see more public discussions like we had today, extending on to the appeal that Dr. Swan had earlier. More public conversation needs to be had. There needs to be a revision of public discourse that reverts to our history that's one-sided on the most part, and I would most definitely like it to be further and heavily implemented into our Bermuda government education system as well as the private schools.
In your research, you have noted research and studies done by others in other communities that face a similar type of, no two communities have the same experience, but the same type of racial amnesia, racial oppression in other communities, right?
Yes, I referenced Canada in the 1950s and the Inuit people and the United States with World War I and industrial era.
Okay. And of course, there are many others.
Yes, most definitely.
And in some of these places, we have seen reconciliation, reparations, all kinds of different responses as the community lifts that veil of amnesia.
Yes.
Right? Do you have, based on your review, do you think any of those kinds of responses would be helpful or useful, productive in Bermuda?
Most definitely. I think that it would be an excellent exercise to have any anecdotal evidence recorded and transcribed as real Bermuda history, because we find that a lot of our history has been trapped in these secret pockets where you have persons who are afraid or unconfident to come and tell their stories. So creating a safe space in which does not put them at space for persecution is definitely something that's needed to move Bermuda forward.
And when you say you have people who are afraid to come forward and tell their stories, you have indicated in your work that there were structural reasons for that, and that people might lose their homes, lose their jobs, otherwise be marginalized further.
Yes, you see that across the empire, that those that revolt against the colonial system are often targeted for harassment and means of their social lives.
So when you say a safe space, a space where there would be no repercussions for coming forward.
Yes, ma'am, that would be correct. And that would be both formal and informal institutions. So just to say there's a law that you're not going to be corrected for this, you should still be able to come for some sort of amnesty in a way.
Just about done, if I can just have a moment.
And Ms. Mulligan, just to add on to that, any reconciliation or open public discourse should not be targeted just to the Black Bermudian community. It needs to be open to all ethnicities that felt disenfranchised or marginalized.
Your one quote near the end of your paper interested me because you said, the quote was that, I'm trying to find it here, but that it is almost impossible, there it is, on page 31, acknowledging that structural racism is practically impossible to dissolve. Its outcomes in health, education, employment, environmental risk, occupational status, and crime are not randomly assigned. Practically impossible to dissolve. That seems very pessimistic.
You will find that some of these structural racism frameworks have been heavily encoded within our legislation system, even so far as the revision of our Constitution will only be allowed if we go independent. Those are things that will be practically impossible depending on who your audience is you're talking to. So it will require significant revision of certain legislatures.
And the legislation, much of our legislation came from a period of, was spawned at a period of time of segregation
Yes.
and this white oligarchy being in control.
Yes, that's correct.
Right, thank you. Those are my questions.
Thank you, Council.
Thank you, Ms. Mulligan. And Ms. Lister, commissioners would like to ask a few questions.
Yes, Justice.
And we'll start with Honorable Parent Chief.
Good afternoon,
Good afternoon, Mr.
Ms.
Chief.
Lister. I'm appreciative of your age, and that's a complimentary statement.
Thank you.
But as a result of your advance in technology, I was deprived of hard copy. At my age, I'm much happier with a piece of paper in front of me than an electrical device. Nevertheless, from your dissertation this afternoon, I've gleaned some things. The terminology amnesia, would you describe that more clearly for me?
Sure, I'm going to
Is
get
it
the...
avoidance of the subject? Is it a forgetfulness of the subject? What do you perceive that to be in lay terms, and how do I understand that terminology?
Sure, let me just, I want to get the exact quote here for you. Give me just one moment. Here we go. So, as quoted from my dissertation, I'll break it down for you in just a
Yes.
moment. By the term of racial amnesia, I refer to the diagnosis of a collective societal condition whereby elements of racial trauma and distress have been forgotten by a population. In this sense, the peoples have been forced to forget their roots, culture, and connection to the land through suppression or replacement of these memories with differential ideals which are displaced from its original context. So with racial amnesia, it specifically interests me in the way that our history has been transcribed over time and internalized by our people with elements that are missing, that give light to true histories that speak to whether it be your physical geographical location or your ethnological traditions and values.
Tell me, will that be correlation or correlative to the terminology that and the expression that people will tell you when you want to raise issues of race, get over it?
Yes.
Is that a phenomenon of what you described?
Yes, I believe
Getting
so.
over the pain, getting over, in other words, slipping into a state of denial of your history. And what would you feel that would achieve, especially with a younger group of people, or a group of people who are now emerging and wanting to, there's this gap. As I said, I think somebody described it as a historical silence. There's a big gap in our black people's history.
Yes, sir. From my perspective, earlier on, this gap of history and not knowing caused our black population to stay silent. But what I'm seeing amongst my peers now, as we've been open to a multitude of resources, whether that be social media or news outlets or archives that were not made available before, we are definitely much more introspective and inquisitive about our histories and our past. And I'm quite proud to say that I am aware of a few young black Bermudians that have made it their task to re-narrate our history and look at it in a more critical light than what has been displayed in the past. So
And-
hopefully with that we see a more genuine reflection of Bermuda history coming to light in the next years.
And then I'll ask the next question. How many people are in your field?
In
How
my
many peers
field,
do you have?
in Bermuda, anthropologists, I don't know of any other. As I came back home, I found it quite difficult to find employment with my field because not many knew what the work or importance of anthropology and cultural politics. But I have some adversaries that have studied law or philosophy, and we combine, have interdisciplinary discussion in that way.
Yes, thank you. More specific question. The era of the 60s Black Power movement, you say social engineering took place in the 70s and 80s. How that social engineering, by whom was it done, and what was the objective of that social engineering in your opinion?
It is my perspective that throughout that time, the UBP created legislation that was used to promote the guise of cultural competency, and that things were fairer and more equal in the legislation presented to aid the black community, but the plights of our people were still the same. So the legislation on the surface did help to some degree, but did not aid us to the root of the grievances.
Are you saying that it was a farce? Was it real? Was it positive? What was it objective? What could you explain that?
The actions indeed were real, but the effects would have been felt differently by different members of the community.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Parent Chief and Ms. Lister. Madame Ford? Yes?
Good afternoon, Ms. Lister.
Good afternoon, Ms. Ford.
Thank you for your very extensive report.
Thank you.
I heard the word stigmatization, used quite a bit in your report.
Yes.
And that was a question I raised with Dr. Swan this morning regarding the people of St. David's. You're a very young person.
Yes.
And I was wondering, do you think that still exists in 2020
Most definitely.
regarding the people of St. David's?
I think so. You often hear Bermudians referencing the dislocation of St. David's, whether it's the distance that it takes to get there or the centipedes. These are translated into negative stigmas that are transferred to the population that have been passed on from generations at points of ignorance.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mrs. Milligan-White?
Yes. Mrs. Lister,
Yes, Ms. Martin.
what an exciting concept you have developed here, racial amnesia.
Thank you.
As a former teacher and a mother of one and a grandmother of three, I recognize the importance of the cultural elements in Bermuda, especially for young black people? And to what extent, my question is, to what extent should we look at the educational system to address that? Not solely, but primarily, because it has to be addressed.
Yes, Ms. Milligan-White, I would definitely agree with you. The education system is a great place to start. I think it's important that our younger generations, speaking more specifically to the youth that are coming up, they see representation in their education system, whether it be something so small as their school books to have kids that are black and white in them, but also teaching them about Bermudian history because, as I mentioned in my dissertation, if you don't know where you came from, you don't know where you're going. So if you've been told that you've always came from a place that has no economic benefit, you have no agriculture, you do not have a sense of self-reflection that gives you the empowerment to go to the next step. So I think it's important that the black community knows that we were not brought to Bermuda and destitute from our own nature. There was a realm that was placed upon us, and that there is a level of self-determination and self-empowerment that will be required to take us to the next level. Thank you.
Thank you. Madam?
Thank you. Thank you, Mrs. Milligan-White. And now I call in Mr. Starling.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I enjoyed listening to your summary. I will look forward to reviewing your report in more detail. One thing that came to my mind when I was listening to you was a quote by Frantz Fanon. I don't think you mentioned Fanon, but I don't think you mentioned this quote. If I'm remembering it properly, it goes, "For a colonized people, the most essential value, because the most complete, is first and foremost the land which will bring them bread and, above all, dignity." From that, I was reflecting on your concept of racial amnesia and the land itself. And I was wondering if I could get your expert opinion as our anthropologist. How important is land for historical memory in terms of sense of place and connecting to one's own history? And also, can existing spatial realities, fixed capital, to use an economic term, of Bermuda be said to reflect patterns of power in past eras?
Yes, I think both those questions are linked, and the answer to that you see quite evident in Bermudian society today through generational wealth gaps. So those families that were afforded the resources and were not disenfranchised as back in the 1920s, those are names that we very well recognize today, be them the Goslings, the Butterfields, the Sperlings, and you hear of the black names in a less positive light. So to that end, you see the legacies that played out back then, 100 years later, still affording those families the same benefits that they had in that time.
Cool, thank you. That's all my questions.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you. And now Mr. Stovall.
Good afternoon, Mrs. Lister.
Good afternoon, Mrs. Stovall.
I was very intrigued, well, not intrigued, but hopefully you can assist in some continuity with reference to the context. Context is king, or in your case, maybe queen. Would it be fair to say that in many ways people are who they are in association with where they live and how they live on the land?
Yes, sir.
In saying that, you touched on, and within the broader context of Bermuda's historical population control and all the facets that entails. In the 1920s, I believe you mentioned that Pembroke's population was 39% of the island.
Yes.
Yes? So with my quick bit of math, that leaves 61% for the remainder remaining 8 parishes,
Yes, sir.
which amounts to approximately 7.5% population coverage per parish,
Yes.
which is probably more or less, depending if you're in Southampton or Smiths Parish. In saying that, what was the highest concentration of population in Pembroke subsequent to the 20s?
Unfortunately, Mrs. Stovall, I cannot answer that question for you. I specifically looked at the report during that time that spoke to the health conditions, so it was limited to that time frame.
If you're able, can you verify, I think in my limited knowledge, I believe the population percentage may have rose to or approached 60% in the 50s and 60s. If you could verify that at some future time, and that would, to me, would sort of further bring relief to that whole aspect of, you know, the population and the concentration and those, you know, those aspects.
Yes, I can certainly provide you with that information at a later date. I know both Dr. Francis and Dr. Swan provided us with Blue Book statistics that would have those figures in there.
Okay, thank you.
But naturally, Mr. Stovall, you would think that the population would continue to rise with birth rates.
Right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stovall. And now Mrs. Spence.
Hi, Ms. Lister. Thank you for that informative view on your studies. I just wanted to ask, are you familiar with the critical race theory?
Sorry?
Critical race theory.
Yes,
Are you
ma'am.
familiar with it? For the benefit of those who are not, according to critical race theory, racial equality emerges from the social, economic, and legal differences that white people create between the races to maintain elite white transfers in labor markets and politics, giving rise to poverty and criminality in many minority communities.
Yes, ma'am.
What would be some of your recommendations to reverse that in terms of educating people? What would you suggest be implemented?
Based on my academic studies as well as my tenure with the Commission, I think the first step is to continue the public discourse so that all of Bermuda society can get comfortable, well, I don't think we'd ever get comfortable with this conversation, but can be more amenable to this conversation than we would have been in the past 100 years. The first step is to get us talking about it. We then have to have a serious revision of the history that denies things that did occur and have maybe things that are not, there's a difference between equality and equitable. So we have to place all members of society on the same scale to continue moving forward and make an active step to ensure that these practices and systems are dismantled so they can't continue. There's no use in putting things in to remedy them on the forefront if you don't dismantle them at the base.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mrs. Spence. Any redress, Mrs.? No further question. Thank you, Mrs. Lister, for your helpful contribution. And we will adjourn now until 10 o'clock in the morning. Thank you, everyone. Thanks.
Thank you.